So can you please give me your name and where you were born?
My name is Lola Kline, but my full name is Lola Bielski Kline, and this is what the story is going to be about, the Bielski Brothers and how they survived in the forests of Poland at the time. I was born in a town called Nowy in Poland, very close to the Russian border, and today that area is known as Belarus. So it's Nowy Belarus.
Can you tell me how you're related to the Bielski brothers?
Okay, my mother is a Belski. She's one of the 12 Belski children. She had one sister, Estelle, and 10 brothers, 4 of which ended up in the woods of Nowy.
Okay, so who were the 4 brothers that ended up in
in the woods of Nowy? Yes. The 4 brothers that ended up there are Tevye, who was the leader of the group. There's a photo of him on the screen right now. The reason he was the leader of the group was because he was very charismatic, and you can see that he's wearing a uniform, and that was a Polish uniform. So he had served for a very short time in the Polish army before the war started, and they thought maybe because of his serving in the army, he would have a little more experience about organizing the group. The next photo would be that of my mother, Taibe, and her brother, Asoil. Asoil was one of the commanders of the group. And there's another photo here of my uncle Zush, who is the 3rd brother that led the group, the Belski group, with my aunt Estelle. Estelle spent the war years in Russia. So the 3 brothers in the forest were Tevye, Asoil, Zush, and there was a 4th brother who was only 11 years old, and his name was Aaron.
Okay, and how did the brothers make the decision to go into the woods?
The Russians came to our part of Poland in 1939. And there were all sorts of rumors about how they were rounding up Jews and killing them. But these were only rumors. And when they arrived in 1939, they started laying down different kinds of edicts. But in 1941, they started rounding up Jews and killing them. So there was a big slaughter in 1941, and that was the time that my parents were rounded up with my uncle Yankel, who was 16 years old, who was still living with my Belski grandparents, and my uncle Aaron that I mentioned earlier. He was on the property, but he wasn't in the house. He was way back on the property. He saw the trucks coming down the road, so he hid behind a tree to see what was happening. When he saw that his parents and his brother were thrown into the truck, he melded back into the woods and he went looking for his 3 brothers that he knew had already set up a small family camp to tell them what was going on. When he found his brothers and told them what he had seen, the brothers told him to go notify Taibe, who was my mother, and she was on the Jancholski farm, that's where she lived, and to tell her that the Germans were rounding up Jews and she was to leave immediately and come join them, which is exactly what he did. He came to the Jancholski farm. He knocked on the window and didn't even come into the house. And he told my mother that the Germans were on their way, that she had to leave immediately. She grabbed me. She put a blanket over me. She didn't even stop to get some food or to pack anything. And she ran after her brother, and he led her into the woods. Now, I want to tell you something about the camp that my uncles had established. Initially, the camp was maybe I don't know, let's say 10, 15 people. And then more people started joining that particular camp. More family members, a couple of friends, it grew to 25, 30 people. I'm not quite sure how many people were actually there when my mother arrived there, but the camp itself had grown to over 1,200 people. And even though they accepted the elderly, women, and children, they really didn't want any babies in the woods. Of course, I was just a baby. I was 9 months old. I was 6 months old at the time. And one of the reasons, well, the main reason that they didn't want babies in the woods was because it was difficult to feed a baby, to keep a baby from crying if there was danger. If a baby started crying, you could hear that noise probably for a mile or even further. Noises traveled in the woods. And when I was about 9 months old and I became sick, they knew that they had to find a home for me. And so I'm almost sure it was my father, knew some people that worked on his property, a Polish couple that was a little bit older. They probably were somewhere around 40 years old, but they didn't have any children. So my father approached them and asked them if they would take care of me. And they agreed to do that. And one of the reasons that they agreed to do that was because they knew what was happening to the Jews at the time, that they were being killed. They really didn't think my parents would survive the war. And since I was just a baby, this was their opportunity to get a child. So arrangements were made between this couple, my Belski family, and of course my father, to bring me to a certain house at a certain time, to place me in a certain spot. I was wrapped in a blanket and a cross was placed around my neck, and a little note was pinned to my blanket saying that I was a Catholic baby, that my parents were too poor to take care of me, and if somebody found me, would they please take pity on me and take me in and take care of me. So on a particular night, my father, his brother Schlinke, my uncle Pinek, my cousin Pinek, who was 16 years old at the time, and one or two other men, besides my uncle Zush, who was one of the leaders of the group, took me to this area called Hutasklana, to a particular house, and placed me under a particular window and waited until somebody came out to pick me up. And what happened was, this was in the winter time. I was 9 months old. I got cold. I started crying. I crawled out of the blanket. And a woman came out. And of course, this was all prearranged. And she saw me there in the blanket. And she picked me up and she brought me into the house to her husband. And she said, look, we found a baby. And maybe we can keep her. Once I was found, the small group of men that came to place me there, my mother was not allowed to go with them because they felt that she might get too emotional. It might be too difficult for her to see this. And they left to join the partisans in the woods. And I came to live with this couple. The couple had to have discussed finding me because their decision was that they should go to the local police department, the police station, to tell them that they found a baby, just in case there was a difficulty later on. So they did. They took me to the police station, which was just a couple of blocks away. And they met with the police captain, and they told him the story about how they found me, and they asked his permission if they could keep me since they didn't have any children. And he acquiesced. He said, okay, it was all right for them to keep me. Now, I want to back up just a little tiny bit and tell you something about the Germans. This was a very dangerous thing that this Polish couple undertook to keep a child that they found the way they found me, because if it was ever discovered that I was Jewish, not only would I be murdered and them for taking me in, but anybody that lived in that house with their entire family would be murdered also. Now, I do want to tell you just a little tiny bit about this house. Today, of course, it's a one-family home. It was just a small home. It had an downstairs two-story home, and each door had another family that lived behind that particular door in that one room. We happened to have a little teeny tiny room where I slept with this couple, and then we had a slightly larger room. But just about everybody in that family had only one room to live in through the war. So if the Germans had discovered that this couple was hiding me and I was Jewish, all the families in that building would have been murdered. There was a person in the building that went to the police, and they said that there was a Jewish child being hidden by a couple that was in that house. And so my foster parents were forced to take me back to the police department with them. Fortunately enough, of course, the captain remembered the incident, and he said that he knew exactly how I was found, and that he didn't want to hear the story again, that I could go back and live with the couple who found me. And that's how I ended up spending the next 3+ years living with this particular couple, who I might add took very good care of me. I do remember certain things that happened at the time. I remember the bombings. I remember being told by the couple never to engage in any talks with the Germans. I remember the Germans coming through this little house where we lived, banging on the different doors, asking if there were any Jews hidden in that building. I remember the scarcity of food at times, but the most important thing that I remember was being taken care of and being loved by the couple who took me in and treated me as if I was their biological child. I had no idea that I had parents outside of this little family unit. These were my parents. These foster people were my parents as far as I was concerned. And that's how I lived out the remainder of the war. In the early part of 1945, after we were liberated, after Poland was liberated by the Russians, my parents, of course, wanted to get me back. My parents came and told my foster parents that they were ready to take me back, but my foster parents refused to give me up. After all, they had kept me for several years and they considered me their own, and they were not about to give me back to my biological parents. My parents made some sort of arrangement with the army, with the Polish army, to have my foster father induced into the army. Even though he was in his 40s, Poland was still fighting and they still needed an active Polish army. The Germans were retreating, but they still needed men in their army. So they called my foster father up, and my foster mother went to visit him. The Polish army was structured very differently. It was difficult. I mean, people came to visit, like my foster mother would come to visit her husband, but she would bring him food. She'd bring him what she felt he needed, because food was scarce too at the time. And so she went to visit him. She packed him some food, and she made arrangements for me to be watched over by some people that lived in this building where we lived, in this little house where we lived. And she went to visit her husband in the army. And of course, my parents knew about this, and because it was all prearranged, probably through bribes, but in any case, it was prearranged. And they showed up on the day that she was gone to visit my foster father. And I remember this day quite well, because I and several of the children that lived in the building at the time had formed a circle in the front yard, and we were playing a game when this strange wagon came up, and these three people got off the wagon and started talking to one of the neighbors that were watching us playing in the front yard. And pretty soon, two of those people came up to the circle, and they wanted to know who Loja was. They had no idea what I looked like. They hadn't seen me in years. And that, of course, that was my Polish name. And I just sat there quietly, because I wasn't about to speak up to people who I didn't know. But one of the older children in the circle got up, and she pointed to me and she said, "She's Loja. That's her name. That's who Loja is." So they came up to me and they asked me a couple of questions, one of which was if I knew the way back to Novogródek, if I knew the road back to Novogródek, that they were lost, and could I lead them back? Could I show them how to get back to Novogródek? And they showed me a bag of candy that they had, and of course, candy wasn't something that children were able to get so easily at the time. It was really a bribe that they were using. And they told me if I would just ride up the road with them a little bit until the curve, so that they wouldn't get lost, that they would give me the bag of candy. And so I got into the wagon with the permission of the woman who was supposed to be the neighbor, who was supposed to be taking care of all of us. That what they probably told her was that my foster parents were detained and that they were going to bring me to them, and that's why they were taking me. So I got into the wagon with them, and we rode up a little bit, and I showed them where the curve was to take them back to Novogródek. But of course, by then it was too late. They wouldn't let go of me. And I got hysterical, and I started screaming and yelling and pounding on them and wanting to get out of the wagon. And I was scared, naturally. I mean, these were strangers. I didn't know who they were. But they held on to me, and we ended up in the village, in the town of Novogródek, at a distant relative's house. He had a little apartment there, and that's where we ended up. I do want to tell you one or two things that happened. This was a very, very difficult time for me, because I was kidnapped. I had no idea who these people were. I was taught to hate Jews, and that wasn't because my foster parents felt that, well, it was for their protection and for my protection that I was taught to hate Jews and fear the Germans. So here I was in the with people I didn't know, total strangers. They were Jews, and I was scared. Several times I tried to get out of the apartment and get back to my foster parents. And I remember one particular incident where I put a shawl around me, around my head and my shoulders, and I went outside, and I was trying to hitchhike a ride. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I was sure that whoever picked me up was going to take me to my real parents, my foster parents. Somebody approached me one time when I was out there and said, well, how you can't just get into somebody's vehicle and wagon or car and expect them to take you. How are they go? What are you going to give them? And I said, well, my father will give them a bottle of vodka, which was the drink, of course. We all know Russians and Poles like vodka. So naturally, that never happened. I never made it back. However, my foster parents found me, found where I was hidden. And I remember one day the door opened when I was inside, and it was my foster mother and father that somebody knocked on. There was a knock on the door, and somebody opened the door, and I couldn't believe it. It was my foster mother and father, and my mother grabbed me, and she ran out the back door. And I really didn't even know what happened at that time. But another time, there was a knock on the door, and my cousin answered the door, and I could see my foster parents right there, and I ran to them, and I grabbed my foster father around the neck. He picked me up. I held on to his ears while my mother, my biological mother, was trying to grab me away from him, and I'm trying to hold on to him, and it was a big scene. But she won out. She grabbed me again. She ran out the back door, and she hid with me again. And there must have been some kind of an arrangement made between my foster parents and my biological parents, because I do remember my foster mother coming to spend nights with me. And that was the only time that I really felt content or safe, when I was with her. We were there for quite some time. We probably were there at this particular place in Novogrudek for maybe 6 months to a year. And we knew we had to leave because the Russians were advancing, and my parents didn't want to be under Russian rule. And so one night, I was awoken one night, and we went to the railroad station, and I remember that pretty distinctly. We had a couple of suitcases with us, and I sat on a suitcase. I remember that. We waited for a train to come. I don't know how these arrangements were made, but in order to travel at that time, there were so many displaced persons, but you still needed papers. And somehow my father got a hold of forged papers for all of us. And we took the train, and we ended up in Germany in a DP camp called Fernwald. And I have a picture, I think, of Fernwald and some of the people that were in the DP camp. I'm the one sitting on my mother's lap. I have that little white hat on. That's my mother. Directly behind me, and in the same row, all the way to the left, is my father's sister, Ruth, my grandmother, Jencholsky, and my father's sister, Haya, sitting right next to my grandmother. And as it ended up, she became my Aunt Haya. And she was married to my uncle Asoil, if you remember. He was one of the leaders of the Trad, the Bielski Partisans, the guerrilla fighters. Now, if you go back into the very last row, to the left, The man with a hat on and a leather coat, that's my father. The rest of the people are strangers to me. They were not part of the Belski tribe. They just happened to be people that ended up in the same displaced person camp, the same DP camp that I lived in.
What was going on with the Bielski Partisans? How were they living in the forests?
Okay, that's an excellent question, and I did want to talk about that a little bit. If you remember, initially I told you that there were more than 1,200 people part of the Bielski Partisans, and they were broken up into smaller groups and hidden, and they had their camp in different parts of the same forest. One of the big forests where they were hidden was called the Belski forest. And the reason they were broken up into smaller groups was because in case one group was discovered, there was enough time for the other groups to be notified so they could go deeper into the forest. Now, I do want to mention this, that the Germans were very afraid of going into the forests themselves. They were a mechanized army. And as I mentioned earlier, the woods were extremely dense. You couldn't even get a motorcycle through them. And even today, if you should happen to be in that part of Belarus, which was Poland at the time, there's no way you could get a motorcycle through most parts of the woods. So the Germans knew that there were partisan groups in the forests of Belarus, of Poland. There probably were a couple of hundred of them throughout all of Poland and most of Europe. There were Russian partisan groups, Polish partisan groups, and of course, Jewish, but they were mostly small bands. And my uncle's group was a very large group, and it was hard to keep them hidden. But what they did was, my three uncles who led the group, had formed an agreement with one of the Russian partisan groups, which were being supplied by the Russian government. And they would do certain favors for the Russians, and the Russians in turn would give them some protection. Now, the Belskis had set themselves up in a very unique way. They actually built a village, and there's evidence of that village. If I went back with two of my grandsons in 2019, and we found the area where they were hidden, and we found artifacts too. We didn't find them, but there's a museum there. These are my two grandsons. And my 13-year-old grandson is on my right, and my 26-year-old grandson with the sunglasses is on my left. And there's a museum there now, the Belski Museum, and there should be a photo of an artifact that was found, a frying pan that was being used in the Belski woods. Now, okay, now what I want to tell you is how the camp itself was structured. As impossible as it seems, there were a number of areas. There was a main area, a main street, and off the main street they had little shacks, little buildings that they built. There was a jail, there was a synagogue, there was a kitchen, where, of course, they cooked meals for the entire group. There was a tailor shop where they fixed clothing, and they fixed clothing for the Russians. There was a mechanic area where they fixed rifles, guns, and they did that for the Russians also in exchange for some protection. So the village itself must have had about 10 different kinds of buildings. There was also a hospital, and there was an area set aside for entertainment.
So how can people learn more about the Belskis if they're interested? We obviously know your narrative because you lived it and you're able to tell us about your life. But what if we wanted to know more about the Belskis who were in the forest?
In 2008, a Paramount movie was made about my family. The name of the movie is Defiance, the Bielski Brothers, and it was directed by Edward Zwick, who likes to make these great big Hollywood shoot-em-ups. Two of his movies are The Last Samurai and The African Diamond. The movie starred Daniel Craig, Lev Schreiber, and Jamie Bell. If you want to know more about the family, you can probably find the movie today on Netflix, or maybe you can even rent it in the library. I want you to see this photo, and I want you to know that this is just maybe a quarter of the family, half of the Bielski family, the descendants of the Bielski brothers that were in the woods. So these are, in the very first row, you will see one of the Belski, my aunt, Sonia, and she was married to my uncle Zush. The rest of them are first cousins and their children. It is estimated that today, from those 1,200 people that the Belskis saved, they might be close to 30,000 people alive, the descendants of the Belski tribe.
Lola, is there anything that you want to say to the students that are watching this workshop?
Try not to bully each other. I know that there's a lot of bullying that goes on in the classroom, in the school, on the internet, and remember, that kind of bullying only leads to hatred and violence. If you see somebody being bullied, try to step in to stop it. Try to like each other, try to appreciate the differences in each other, and try to learn from those differences and see how beautiful they will enhance your own lives.